Awesome. Good morning, EO Nashville. So this morning, thanks for joining us to learn more about Middle Tennessee transportation challenges and how we can be more involved in shaping solutions for the region. It's hard to believe this is our 25th installment of the EO Exchange. And as always, the last 15 minutes this morning, you're going to be placed in a small group to talk with some prompts to get the conversation going. We've set aside time for Q&A, so I'll be the last, or after 30 minutes, we'll have about 15 minutes of Q&A. And today we're excited to have Michael Skipper and Sean Falzer from the Greater Nashville Regional Council. And I want to go through some bios really quick. Michael has more than 20 years of experience in public policy, community and regional planning, social research, serving 9 years as executive director of the Nashville Area MPO, which is a metropolitan planning organization, before being hired to lead the 80+ member staff of the Greater Nashville Regional Council. The two organizations were integrated to form a more comprehensive council of governments to serve the planning and community development needs of the region in 2017. Michael is also the lead facilitator and advisor to the Middle Tennessee Mayor's Caucus. The Mayor's Caucus was formed in 2009 in order to provide leadership on important issues facing a rapidly changing regional landscape. And Michael, before you get started, I'm going to ask you a question about that. He also directed the Public Transportation Work Program for an MPO in Central Florida, as well as on the development of legislation that led to the creation of the Tampa Bay Regional Transportation Authority. He has 2 degrees from 2 different UTs, it looks to me. So University of Tennessee undergrad and University of Texas master's, and a graduate of leadership Middle Tennessee and the second class of Leadership Tennessee. He completed a year-long fellowship with the U.S. German Marshall Fund to study regional governance models across the Atlantic Ocean. So Michael, appreciate you being here. I'm going to introduce Sean, then I'm going to ask you the question about the Mayor's Caucus. Sean Falzer, also here with us today. He's the Transportation Planning Manager on the GNRC. Since August 2016, he coordinates the transportation planning process carried out by the Nashville Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. Previously, he served on the Capital Improvements, served as the Capital Improvements Program Manager and worked with local governments across Middle Tennessee to understand and address their infrastructure needs. Prior to joining the GNRC, he worked as the Boston Region MPO for 7 years on planning and programming for transportation infrastructure needs of the region's 101 cities and towns. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in history, fellow history major here, from Grinnell College in Iowa, and holds a Master's of Science in City Planning from Boston University. Thank you guys for both being here. Michael, I was going to ask you just to find the Middle Tennessee Mayor's Caucus and tell us who's involved and why that's important, because our group spans all around Middle Tennessee, not just Nashville.
Yeah, and there's actually, it's interesting, when the caucus got started in 2009, it was formed sort of disconnected from the regional council. And since then, we've integrated the NPO program that I used to manage with the caucus into the regional council. So it's, its definition is even evolving. But in short, basically, that was started back in 2009 under Mayor Dean's leadership as a way of improving relationships between city and county mayors across Middle Tennessee. It was really interesting as staff. We're working for all these mayors, and I think we are projecting our relationship with them, directly, laterally across the board. And kind of one thing that we realized one day is that they really know each other. They were pleasant to each other at these monthly meetings that we were having, but they didn't have the relationships that were going to be necessary to tackle some of these regional challenges. And so we started the caucus and did a lot of network building, shared learning, probably very similar to what you're doing with the entrepreneur group. And then, out of that came trust and conviction for some of the issues that they needed to work on together. It's evolved into the government affairs legislative agenda setting arm of the regional council, which is also composed of mayors, which I'll talk about here in a second. But we really like to protect the sanctity of that form and make it, the mayor's space to get, to do peer collaboration and learn about each other more than anything else.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. And like always, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'm going to come back around the bottom of the hour, go through those questions, and we'll go from there. Michael, right. It's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Sean and I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about Transportation, which is, we just talked about the mayors a second ago, which is the top issue on their minds. There are other issues that they think about on a regular basis, but probably none more than transportation and what we're going to do about growing congestion and increasing roadway safety challenges and the lack of funding to fix some of those problems. So I appreciate you inviting us to be with you, and I appreciate all the help that Marla has been getting ready for today. I'm looking forward to the small groups. We've got a lot of information. We tend to Sean was sharing a story before we get started about how his kids think that his job is boring, and we're going to try to keep it from being boring today, but sometimes slides do put people to sleep. So I want to kind of set the table with some information about the regional transportation plan that was adopted earlier this year and its significance to solving some of these issues. But do look forward to the Q&A and the small group where we can get a lot more interactive. Before we dive into transportation, I do think it's really important that one of your takeaways today, if you don't already know this, is that there is a regional council of governments for Middle Tennessee. And there has been since the 60s, like there has been in most metropolitan areas of America, when the federal government and the US Congress in particular were deciding in the 60s basically to delegate decision-making authority for how federal funds are going to be used for infrastructure or social services to local communities. And we don't have time this morning to get into all the history, but it very much was sort of a civil rights issue and some of the bad decisions that were made out of DC in terms of local investments. And so in the 60s, basically Congress said, you know what, we want to continue to invest in infrastructure and social services, but we want local elected officials to guide that process. And so the feds incentivize these the state governments across America to form councils of governments or economic development districts. We were established as an economic development district and then sort of emerged as a council of government a few years later. But it's the purpose of these development districts or councils is to convene local elected officials with state officials to cooperatively decide how federal funds should be invested into infrastructure or social services. And because so much of Tennessee's funding is driven by federal funds, then the byproduct is it's also sort of driving a lot of the state investments as well. And so it's a really important role that the council plays here in Middle Tennessee and that our counterparts play across America is to really provide some granularity to the decision-making process for how dollars are going to be invested into our communities from federal sources. There is a literal council, just like there's a metro council, there is a regional council that is made up of 93 folks, 52 city mayors across 13 counties. The county mayors, county executives of those counties are also on that council. There are 2 state legislators on that council, and then each county mayor is empowered to appoint 2 citizens from their county to that council, one to represent issues of business and commerce, might be of interest to some of you folks online, and the other to represent issues of social equity and inclusion from within their county. And so you've got essentially a 93-member council that is the space where these city and county mayors are getting together on a regular basis to set policy and to ultimately decide how to direct federal funds into Middle Tennessee. Staff-wise, we've got 80 plus folks. About half of our crew are social workers who are dealing directly or assisting directly with the older adults across Middle Tennessee. We, in our role with the federal government, we manage a 13-county area agency on aging and disability, which is just really connecting seniors with services to help them stay in their home as long as possible. One particular service that you might be interested in for an aging parent or yourself when you get to that point is we do the unbiased Medicare counseling for Middle Tennesseans. So we're a resource for that. There's a lot of confusing information about that, particularly during open enrollment. And so that's one of the things that we do through that program. We also have a strong economic and community development team, which is helping cities and counties, nonprofits, in some cases private businesses, track down state and federal grants for investing in projects that are going to retain or recruit jobs. A lot of that money is going to site-specific infrastructure. We also do small business lending out of that shop, SBA loans, as well as a couple of loan products that we have at GNRC. And then the third department or vertical within our organization is the community and regional planning group, which does regional planning, so regional scale planning, like the transportation planning that we'll talk about today. But we also serve as an extension of local government staff. There are about 13, 14 communities across Middle Tennessee who don't have their own local planning staff for their planning commissions. And so we are that staff by way of contract. Do a lot of consultant work as well, where a city might hire us to do a strategic plan for their city council or update a comprehensive growth plan. Versus going with a private sector company, and typically there are good reasons for them to do that. Our impact is felt far and wide. This is a 13 county look of our region, plus Murray County, which is part of our transportation work. We try to make sure that the benefits of the regional council and the programming that we do are touching Middle Tennesseans, both rural, suburban, and urban across the entire mid-state. More information about us, probably the best place to go is gnrc.org/annual report for a streamlined look at some of the things that we do in your community. But I want to focus now on sort of how we go about our transportation planning work and really why we're in this space to begin with. And so as the regional council, we're also a federally designated metropolitan planning organization. And the way the federal gas tax works, we pay at the pump, it goes to DC, it gets redistributed back to states and regions across America. Back in the 60s, as I was saying earlier, as the Congress was delegating a lot of the decision-making authority, one of those was specifically for transportation. And so metro areas across America each have a metropolitan planning organization, or MPO, which is governed by a policy board. Ours is called the Transportation Policy Board. And that policy board convenes city and county mayors, transportation officials who have that shared responsibility, and they are empowered to decide where each of the dollars that come out of DC are spent on roadways, bridges, transit, walking, and biking facilities across Middle Tennessee. Whether it's a dollar being implemented by TDOT, Metro government, and the new Nashville DOT, or WeGo Public Transit, the federal funds that those entities use will not flow through as a cash flow standpoint, but will be programmed by the Transportation Policy Board as basically a statement of the prioritization of the need that the entity is looking to fund. So those dollars are programmed through the Transportation Policy Board. We program those dollars in accordance with a regional transportation plan that's adopted every 5 years by city and county mayors and transportation officials. And that's what Sean is going to talk to you about now. This is a look at the cover of the about 35-page executive summary. It's available at gnrc.org/mid10connected. There's another URL I'll give you a little bit later that's going to give you access to a whole spectrum of information that went into this. But let me turn it over to Sean Falzer, who leads our transportation planning work. He could talk a little bit about the importance of this plan, why you should care, and some of the investments that are scheduled between today and the year 2045. Sean?
Thank you, Michael, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate you guys having us here today and for thinking transportation is important. I think this is uplifting after my daughter told me how I had a boring job yesterday afternoon. So I appreciate that. Talking about the regional transportation plan, as Michael mentioned, kind of one of the most important aspects is that the plan is really the gateway to federal funds. And so all of these entities from TDOT to transit agencies to our local governments, programming the projects and including them for funding on this transportation plan is really what provides them access to these federal funds, which is essential for transportation because federal funding makes up such a predominant share of transportation investments that we make within the region. And going to the next slide, there's kind of requirements from the federal level. And so a lot of these transportation plans across MPOs across the country are fairly generic of some of those requirements that we all have to follow. They are conducted across the country because they're required for all metro areas that are greater than 50,000 people. They do have to be long range and look out 20 plus years and include all projects that are going to be receiving federal funding or are regionally significant. So a lot of capacity adding projects or transportation projects that are on major facilities, interstates, connectors to freight networks and other facilities around the region. And one thing, it has to be fiscally constrained. And so that's one of the things that we often grapple with is we have more needs than we have available funding for. And so given that we need to balance it and only program projects for which we have available funding for over that time frame, a lot of projects don't always make it onto our fiscally constrained list. And then in terms of some of the factors that we use to guide project selection, obviously referring to these key federal planning factors that we can dive into a little bit more, but focus on safety, congestion, economic development. And then also some of these performance-based planning requirements as well, tied to maintenance of the system, safety, and other measures. And we do go through the update process of our regional transportation plan every 5 years, at least every 5 years. And so we updated our last plan through the pandemic and adopted it in February of 2021. And so it is still fairly fresh, but as I'll touch on in the upcoming slides, we do update it because assumptions continue to change. So this would be a good example. What we're looking at over the lifespan of this RTP is about $10.5 billion in investments over that time frame. Kind of starting out, just to give you a sense of what that looks like on an annual basis. Kind of our baseline funding is about $250 million being spent in the region in a given year. And our growth assumptions, as we looked out over that time frame, we had revenue growth of 2% annually, and then expected inflationary
Did we lose him? Did we lose Sean?
Given last year's inflation was even higher than what we anticipated. And then on the revenue side, we have a federal transportation bill that was recently passed, which is going to, at least in the short term, increase that 2% to closer to 25% annually. And so we'll have some additional funding available, but also dealing with combating these inflationary factors as well. And so trying to put that number of the 10 billion in context, looking at some of our peer regions across the country, 10 billion seems like a lot. However, when we kind of compare ourselves to a lot of peer regions and look at on a funding per capita basis, it really is not all that much. We're actually kind of at the bottom of this list here of comparing against a lot of peer regions of our size. There's 15 others that are above us on this list, and I think what this shows is that we're heavily dependent on the federal funding that's coming to that region, and some of these other places like Atlanta, Austin, Denver that have invested in transit have been able to pull additional resources, whether it be from the state, regional, or local level. Predominantly from the local level, I guess, when we're talking about transit investment, to supplement what they're getting from the federal government to be investing in transportation. And so Mike will probably touch a little bit more on this dependency on federal funds, but this just kind of puts into context that we could be we would benefit from having more access to funding within our region for transportation investments. And so with that 10 billion, we'll go through kind of how that is being invested across different project types. Kind of guiding those investments are regional goals that we've established through the regional transportation plan, looking at maintaining the system, so maintaining a state of good repair, improving safety for all users, mitigating the congestion that our region is experiencing to keep it moving. One of our other goals is increasing access to economic opportunity so that folks can get to jobs, and then minimizing disruptive impacts. This pertains predominantly to minimizing the disruptive impacts to the environment and for vulnerable populations within our region with the investments that we're making. And then lastly, we want to be, this is a coordinating document and bringing together a lot of different entities and a lot of different project proponents. And so we want to be aligning our investments with local, state, and even national plans and policies. And so looking at how that funding is allocated, a significant portion, 65 of it is allocated specifically to individual projects over that 25-year horizon. And about 35% of it is allocated or set aside for future calls for projects. And so those are just programs or projects that will be assigned to at a later date. And so within those projects that we've identified that and can be mapped, about 3/4 of those are Improve Act projects that you may be familiar with the 2017 law of nearly 1,000 projects identified through the Improve Act with the increase in the state gas tax to be implemented over the near-term horizon. And so a significant portion of those projects are identified and accounted for in our regional transportation plan. And I think another thing that's important is even though we're looking out 25 years, a lot of the investments consist of prior commitments that we've made in the short term, and about half of them are prior commitments that will just need to be require funding over the long term in order to fully see them through construction. And so we'll take you through a couple of maps of where these investments are located. And so this identifies those projects by the different time horizons. And so we identify projects that will be completed by 2025 as in the projects in the short term, 2035 as midterm, and then projects completed by 2045 as those long-term investments. And so you can see those and where they're located across the region, as well as some of those unfunded needs that we didn't have available funding for, identified in yellow. And then looking at kind of the types of projects and who the applicant was. And so TDOT is a major project proponent and implementer within our region. The investments in the RTP that TDOT will be implementing are identified in red. And then those that were submitted by local project proponents, local governments within the region, are identified in blue. And just looking at kind of the different project types that we're doing, there is a significant portion dedicated to capacity, either new roads or road widening projects. Given the growth that our region is experiencing, I think there's a lot of roads that are in need of additional capacity to handle that growth and development. And then also investments for reconstructing existing roads or upgrading existing roads to incorporate bicycle and pedestrian accommodations as well. And then we'll take you through a couple of slides here, just showing kind of those projects that are identified in the RTP and then how they correspond to some of those needs that we've talked about. And so one is when it comes to roadway safety, we've identified areas within the region that are our highest crash areas within the region. And you'll see that nearly all of our investments are located within those areas that have been identified as safety concerns or high crash areas. When it comes to congestion, we've also identified kind of what are those top 10% of areas that are most congested within the region. Predominantly on interstates and arterial major state routes within the network. And about 2/3 of our projects are located within those areas of high congestion. Also, looking at vulnerable populations, we want to be mindful of how these investments relate to areas within the region that we've identified as our highly vulnerable communities, where there's a number of groups that we've identified as disadvantaged or vulnerable populations and where they're located. And so we want to be mindful as these projects enter project development and they get further fleshed out in their scope, that we want to be mindful of their impacts on these vulnerable populations within the region. And similarly, when it comes to the environment, we've identified areas that are environmentally sensitive areas within the region. And so as these projects enter project development and go through the NEPA process, review and approval, we want to make sure that these investments are not having a disproportionate impact or negative impact on the environment. In terms of how this funding and allocation of funding to projects is equitably distributed across the region, we did a couple of looks at how the funding was allocated across the counties and took into account not only population within those counties, but also how much vehicle travel is within those counties, and then how many federal aid lane miles or roadway infrastructure is within those counties, and had a pretty equitable distribution between the investments and those metrics across the 7 counties within the MPO area. And so if you want to explore, the plan is multiple chapters and goes into a lot more detail about each of these components, the investments, the goals, and some of the needs that we've identified for the region. And so you can go to gnrc.org. Underneath our browse by topic, there's a transportation and mobility, and you can find the regional transportation plan, or you can go directly to gnrc.org/RTP to access that document. And then I'll also promote a number of interactive tools that we have on our website that if you're more visually inclined and like using maps over reading the narrative, we have a regional plan map that's at gnrc.org/map/2045 RTP. And you can go in and see all of the projects that applied for funding, all the projects that secured funding, and details about each of those on a map of the region. And then we also have an interactive tip database, which the Transportation Improvement Program is the implementation arm or the short-term capital plan of our regional transportation plan, and identifies all the projects that we're going to be doing over the next 4 years within the region. And so we've talked a lot about the regional transportation plan. The TIP is probably the most important document that we have, because it's where projects are actually being identified to get construction funding and get completed. But we don't have enough time to dive into that today. The only other one that I'll mention is the Tennessee Department of Transportation also has a similar application that they've made available known as iTrip. And so there's some additional detail that you can pull from that application on projects that are underway in the region, particularly when it comes to maintenance and some of the resurfacing needs that might be of interest to you. I think that's all from my slides, and so I'll turn it back to Michael to wrap us up.
Thank you, Sean. I know we're coming up to 9:30 and want to be respectful of your time. I want to get to the Q&A as soon as possible, but we did want to give you a sense of how we see things and how the public saw things as we went through this process. We want to be very transparent about it's really great that there's $10.5 billion of federal funds coming our way that will be invested into those projects, but still a lot of shortcomings with what we're able to do to address transportation across our region, namely funding. Y'all know this, probably a lot of the Q&A is going to be focused on funding initiatives, so on and so forth. But I mean, we're not competing, to be honest with you, with our other peer metros, both those that are our present day size, as well as the size that we are trending towards. I skipped over some of our projection slides for time today, but we do a lot of modeling of future year development, traffic forecasting, so on and so forth. And we're very much headed to be bigger than present day Denver by 2045, which is just really right around the corner. They're spending 607% more per capita on transportation than we are here in Middle Tennessee. And you saw that table that Sean presented to you earlier. We have so much reliance on the federal funding. We haven't really diversified that portfolio here in our state to pull in other sources of funding to get transportation infrastructure and transit services where they really need to be to keep us economically competitive with these other regions. The other thing, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, but the reality is you think we're spending all this money to address congestion in the plan that Sean mentioned, that it would have a significant impact on either reducing or mitigating congestion. But the reality is, because we only have enough money to scratch the surface, what we're actually doing in some cases is adding capacity to places that are going to get more cars quicker to where the congestion is, right? Because we just don't have enough funding to really completely reconstruct those really heavily congested areas with the right type of infrastructure that would be needed. And so in some ways, and this is counterintuitive, also the really probably more of a short-term impact, we're actually going to be, as a result of these investments, potentially, seeing a further decline in congestion because of those. And just imagine that in a way, if you've got, you add capacity upstream from where the congestion is, you could sort of cause more congestion downstream if you're not fixing those bottlenecks. And there's a little bit of that happening with the projects that are funded in the plan. And we've got to be mindful about that so that we're actually addressing those bottlenecks and just not adding system capacity for the sake of growing that capacity. There's a lot more work to do, more collaboration, more innovation, more multimodal. I'm coming in and out of the sunlight I can see on the screen, so just ignore that. More innovation. I know one of your colleagues online is Robert Hartline, and we actually are funding $1.6 million to his company called Hitch, which incentivizes Middle Tennesseans, and in our context, but they have a national footprint, but it incentivizes people to ride share or travel during times of day when there's less congestion, or to hitch a ride with somebody who otherwise doesn't have access to a vehicle, or even incentivize people to take transit together. So it's a way of using money more efficiently. And we can build very expensive highways, or we could give pennies on the dollar incentive rewards to actual residents in our region to travel in a way that has less impact on the system. So we're very excited about the project that we have about to get underway with Robert, Mark Cleveland, his partner, and Hitch, the name of the company there. And then the revenue issue is just something we're going to have to address. Nobody wants to see their taxes increased or fees increased, but we also don't want to see continued deterioration of our transportation system, which is going to create even higher cost to our economy and our quality of life than what we would maybe pay directly in those higher taxes and fees. In terms of your opportunities to get involved, I mean, really, getting involved in your local government, their transportation planning process is essentially the same as getting involved in our process. We're really a ground up type of organization. Our thinking about transportation starts with the way the local mayors, the local transportation experts are thinking about transportation. Also important to stay involved once a decision is made about a project, to stay involved in its design and implementation too, because that's really where a lot of concerns can be addressed. I mean, we've got to make improvements, obviously, and that means we're going to be changing changing your neighborhood, changing your major thoroughfare, and it's important to engineer these projects in a way that mitigate those concerns. Maybe not completely eliminate some of the concerns, but engineers are willing to listen to concerns and try to work a design that's going to work for everybody. And then I'm going to give you solvethistogether.org as a URL. There's one URL that you remember from today. You think I'd put it on the screen, but it's solvethistogether.org. It is a website, really a hub that we have launched to get a regional conversation going around transportation. You can find the plan and all the maps and all the data dashboards that we bring to the table online at that URL, but it's just a good place to go if you want to be part of the conversation. We're going to be updating the plan again. We also have the new federal funds coming our way and could use your help to understand how to prioritize that money for greatest impact. So encourage y'all to go to solvethistogether.org. Also looking forward to the Q&A, so I'll stop there and see what questions y'all might have. Richard?
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Perfect. So drop your questions. If you have some questions, please put them in the chat. I wrote down a couple before we started, but one of the things I think about, and I hate comparisons, but I think you're always comparing, to people are always comparing and what it's like somewhere else. Are there cities, like on the list we talk about where we are in the funding, which is clearly has to be an uphill battle for our area, but compared to those other cities, is there a city out there that's a cautionary tale that had all the money that didn't do it right, theoretically? And in the inverse, or the same question the other way around, or what are examples where people really, other communities in other areas spent the money, well, and did a good job as far as getting that money to the right spots? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think I'd stop short of, and you're not asking me to do this, but I'd stop short of saying the city did it all wrong and the city did it all right. I mean, usually what happens is that anytime anybody implements a policy or a strategy, it's really important for us to go study what challenge were they trying to address, what was their response to that challenge, how did they get it implemented, what worked, what didn't work, so that if we do try to do something similar, it could be a better version of that. And there's a lot of that happens within the world of transportation, just kind of watching what others are doing. Mayor Cooper, as you all know, you probably heard the name Faye DeMassimo. He hired Faye out of Atlanta when he was just, I think that was one of his first hires. He hired her out of Atlanta to come to Nashville to help us think through our transportation challenges, specifically within Davidson County. And I'd say that Atlanta is Atlanta is probably an answer to both of those questions, because I'd say during the 80s and 90s, when they were expanding their highways in a very massive way, some of it driven by the Olympics, the thought being we're going to have a really great transportation system. But what it did is just exacerbate the sprawl, put more people on the roadways for longer distances, and really just created a congestion nightmare that many didn't have any optimism that they could get through. But more recently, and Faye was involved in some of this in Atlanta, they begin to understand you've got to give people other options than being in their car. Congestion is going to be part of our reality, probably forever. So what are the ways you can give people an ability to not be held hostage by that congestion, right? The dedicated buses, the lanes, the dedicated light rail, telework, ride sharing incentives so that you're shifting commute times. So Atlanta really in the last few years, I'd say, has done a lot of good things right. And a lot of it also relates to land use. It's not just about the transportation system. It's also about what's generating the demand, where's the demand being generated? And the answer to those questions are often the decisions we're making about development, how we're developing, where we're developing, how a site is being constructed in terms of its urban design, its interface with the roadway. If you put a lot of developments along a corridor and they all each have a driveway cut, all those are bottlenecks. And so just thinking through even the development is a good way to solve some of our transportation challenges. And so I say Atlanta fits both of those. Denver's invested significantly in rapid transit to the tune of about $10 billion at this point, getting a lot of funding from the federal government because of their local skin in the game as a result. And you see in some of their regional corridors that have really high quality transit, 25 to 50% market share of commuter trips in Denver, right? It's not Chicago, it's not New York. It's not super high density, it's enough density, but it's a convenient option. And it doesn't matter how slow the interstate gets because you can hop on the light rail and it's the same time of day every single day. And when you want to add capacity, you just increase the frequencies. You're not having to take in additional land and build extra lanes. And so I think regions that have been able to provide those options are a lot more resilient to the congestion that will continue to increase on the roadway system.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, got a couple of questions in the chat here. So Murray Allen, so it's a couple parts here. One, do you think the city should use traffic engineers to manage traffic around Titans games and large events instead of the police managing this, similar to what Atlanta does?
Yeah, I can say that's a big focus of Faye. I think one of the things that, we learned through the Let's Move Nashville ballot initiative, which is probably something you're all familiar with, the big vote to increase the sales tax for transit, was there wasn't enough confidence in people. There wasn't enough people to have enough confidence that we're doing everything we could with our existing resources. And that's one of those that I think we can do a lot better at, is just managing traffic around special events. And we're not a place that has like infrequent special events. I mean, we have special events every day. And it shouldn't, we should be the best in the world at managing traffic around special events. And I think most people would agree that we're not. And it may be for the reasons that the question implied, which is who's managing traffic. And this is where technology comes in, and all of our signals are typically pre-timed. So you'll see police officers overriding, with the little, with the button. Well, there's technology that can understand upstream, downstream traffic, the directions that it's coming from, and then on the fly change the timing patterns just automatically. So think about all the money we're spending on manually controlling traffic during these events that could be put to better use to solve longer term transportation problems if the base technology was more on par with the best practices that are out there. So I think it's a great question. And I think dealing with those things and just demonstrating that we've done everything we can with existing resources opens the door for a more productive conversation about the major investments and the things we know we also need.
I think there's so many layers to this onion. It's everybody, the easy thing is say, oh, it's a problem, but God, it's so hard.
It's overwhelming. It overwhelms a lot
sure.
of people. You have to just, it's like one foot in front of the other. It's the only way to approach it.
All right, and I'm going to call an audible here a little bit. The small groups are great, but I want to keep going through questions. So if that's good with you, we're going to keep rolling for the questions for a while. I may shorten our small group just a little bit, but these are the second, third with Murray's are kind of related, just around safety. So talking about texting and driving, and if vehicles had to go through an annual safety test, do you think that would improve road safety? Or those, this is again going back upstream. Do you have any quick comments on those?
Yeah, and Sean, feel free to hop in here. Yeah, I think so. Anytime you can, when accidents happen because of vehicles stalling out for reasons that could be prevented, I mean, I think every little thing helps. That's got to be weighed with the burden that would be placed on folks to go through those safety inspection programs. But I've lived in states where I had to do that. It's just a way of life and not really anything that's, it was a lot less difficult to do that than get my emissions testing, right? And a lot of that is just how you're implementing those testing programs. So yeah, I think those are really creative ways at trying to do everything you can to remove bottlenecks that happen on the roadway. And the congestion maps, we didn't share with you the congestion maps. They're in the slide deck if you're interested in seeing them, but we've got all the growth projections, the traffic congestion projections. They're really scary maps. And as scary as they are, that's congestion caused by roadway volumes. And the leading cause of congestion is not volume. It's significant, but it's the incidents that are happening on the roadway. It's the accidents, the crashes. And so the more you can prevent those accidents from happening, either by having safer vehicles or safer infrastructure. And our infrastructure isn't always safe. Poor striping, too many cars for the curvature of the geometric of the roadway that is now outdated. All that plays into the congestion that you see on the roadway and the lives lost. Some of the slides we skipped over, I feel really bad about. I mean, a 76% increase in pedestrian fatalities in the last 5 years. Like, how's that acceptable to anybody? So safety, really, I'd say, Sean, wouldn't you, that was probably more of a pressing issue for us with this plan update than even the congestion issue.
Yeah, and I'll just add that during the pandemic, one trend that we saw that was alarming was an increase in traffic fatalities overall, between 2019, 2020, and a lot of it, there were higher speeds, there was less congestion on the roadways. And so there's not only vehicle fatalities, but as Michael mentioned, there's, as vehicles were traveling faster, there was also more vulnerable users being subjected to fatalities as well. And so we're continuing to look at that and identify opportunities for improvements. And I think with the latest federal infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, there's a number of programs identified within there targeted at safety and particularly for vulnerable users like pedestrians.
Thank you. David Hornsby has a question. So since our current mayor was an ardent opponent of light rail in the 2018 plan, citing a lack of population density, is it safe to assume that the light rail is off the table for the next proposal? And if so, what are the alternatives to replace light rail in these main arteries, and what option makes the most sense to you guys?
Yeah, I don't think anything is off the table per se. And a lot of times it's what's on the table depends on the horizon that we're considering, right? So if it's something that we're trying to get out there in the next 5 or 10 years, then light rail is a heavy lift. But it may be a better long-term solution. So if we're going to do something different in the short term, then it's likely going to be trying to get dedicated lanes for buses. So buses aren't sitting in the traffic. They could be a lot more efficient and give people a true way to get out of congestion. If you increase bus service in congested corridors, then, you know, there's better access to a non-private auto, but the efficiency of the movement isn't any better. And so communities, big and small, Eugene, Oregon, for example, very small community, college town, but very small community, has an amazing bus rapid transit system, relatively low cost, very flexible. And thinking about bus rapid transit in the short term, you know, think about the long term as well, and think about alignments that could be upgraded to rail over time once the densities are there and the investment is going to be fruitful. So engineering, thinking about the alignments and the land uses that you're sort of stimulating the growth and development that's developing in response to that, and how you manage that growth, making sure that you're thinking about the long term, even if the short term solution isn't rail. I think, you know, it's only a matter of time before you hit a certain amount of capacity limitations with the bus rapid transit. That's when you start thinking about upgrading to rail, where you get a lot more efficiency and sort of the movements along the corridor.
Perfect. And Bethany kind of had a similar question there, so I appreciate you answering that. And if I missed this, I apologize, but she was also specifically asking, let me go to the bottom here, sorry. It's for moving large amounts of people from way out in the corridors, especially for the lowly paid workforce, because we all understand the, you know, living close to work right now is a challenge for many folks downtown. So
yeah. Yeah, and there's a part of the regional transportation plan includes a vision for rapid transit across Middle Tennessee, right? And so it's a little bit different on the transit side than the highway side. On the highway side, you know, we'll identify a corridor that needs to be improved. We generally know what the solution is going to look like, right? It's going to be higher tech and more multimodal than the solution maybe 10 years ago. But, you know, otherwise it's a pretty straightforward thing. And then it just becomes an issue of, is there a sufficient right of way and funding to get it done? On the transit side, it's all those questions that you just asked, which is like, we know we need rapid transit here that moves a lot of people very quickly, very efficiently, but is it going to be what mode, what technology, where the station's going to be? You know, it's just so much more complexity to planning and implementing a transit system, and people want to be part of those decisions. It's not as easy for planners or policymakers to just say, well, that's the project. I mean, there's been the perception that's happened before, and look where we've gotten, right? So, I mean, people want to be involved in where stations are, and whether it's bus or rail, and its operating characteristics, its look and feel. And that's just it's a more drawn out process. And then the other thing is that you get to the end of this process and you've made a decision. Well, the way this works is that to tap into the federal funds to help you construct these large capital projects, they kind of require you to have skin in the game, dedicated funding for transit. And Nashville's one of the largest metros in America. And, you know, 10 years ago, I used to go around saying, I lived in Florida at the time. Well, I lived in Florida 20 years ago now, I guess. But like, it used to be Orlando and Nashville were the only two communities, major metros, that didn't have dedicated funding for public transit. And it's kind of a prerequisite. I mean, we still don't. So it's a prerequisite to tapping into the billions that we could get out of the federal government to help us construct the system. That's what Denver's done. That's what Charlotte has done. That's what Austin has done. They're all tapping into those federal programs. But it's just a lot more complex to do it on the transit side, but that's not a reason not to try and not a reason not to move forward.
Absolutely. David Hornsby, again, well, one of the criticisms of the prior plan was it did not coordinate with regional partners. It sounds, this is all looping together here. Did not include participation commitments from surrounding counties. The main arteries did not even reach the county lines, and thus would do nothing to reduce interstate traffic in the near term. Also, Metro would be very pregnant with sunk costs before negotiating participation commitment. Scrolling, participation commitment from any of the surrounding counties. And how are we going to address this going forward with these? If we knew we had these issues before, how do we address those going forward on the next negotiation?
Yeah, that's a fair criticism. I think there's a lot more coordination and collaboration that's happening than the perception. But if people don't see it, they don't understand the connection, then it should be criticized, to be honest with you. You can't ask people to just take a leap of faith that, of course, they're coordinating. I mean, you got to demonstrate and prove it. But I'll tell you where we are coordinating. So the Let's Move Nashville initiative, the program of projects. So the word plan also just messes everything up, right? Like, what plan are you talking about, right? I know what plan you're talking about from the question because of the context. Talking about the Let's Move Nashville plan. That plan was actually, I would say that's a program of projects that was attached to a specific funding initiative to fund those projects being a subset of the regional plan that we just talked about, right? The difference is that Nashville defined the specifics to some of the projects that we had identified in our regional plan. So we have the regional plan that said we need this transit in the region, including Davidson County. And then the city says, well, this is how we want to deliver those projects. And then this is our proposal to fund those projects. Let's go ask the voters. So that coordination did exist. There wasn't really a disconnect between the intent of what that ballot initiative was trying to do and the regional plan that Sean mentioned. The other way there was coordination is that Metro is exercising new authority granted to them by state law that was put into the Improve Act that Sean mentioned during that going through the General Assembly at the request of our regional mayors. And so our regional mayors are who lobbied this Tennessee General Assembly for Metro's right and the other counties in Middle Tennessee's right to ask voters to raise taxes and dedicate them to transit. And so that was a coordinated effort as well. It's just the challenge we have in Middle Tennessee is it's a little bit difficult to get to a regional taxing authority, right? Where you can put all those projects on the same ballot initiative. It's also very challenging to think about Williamson County going to the ballot at the same time Nashville is. What if Nashville fails, but that's where the projects start? Like, what do you can't you really build them backwards, right? So it's complex, but there was more coordination than meets the eye. But if it's not clear to people, you can't expect them to, go all in. I get that.
You used the word, I think, overwhelming earlier, and that's, I think, what I have going around in my head over and over. The whole piece is overwhelming. That sounds like part of the challenge too. Amtrak, it's a great question. Amtrak received a large amount of money to update the rails. Will some of that come through Nashville?
Amtrak would like to think so, right? I mean, Amtrak staff has proposed a Atlanta, Chattanooga, Nashville, Louisville corridor. And our mayors are studying it. Sean can talk a little bit about the work he's doing with Mayor Bell out of Lebanon, who's chairing a task force of our Transportation Policy Board, working with mayors in the I-24 corridor to figure out what kind of position we're going to take on that as an organization, how we are going to ultimately work with the state legislature in support of something like that. So we're very much studying the pros and cons of all that. I mean, on the surface, when we poll our members, the mayors across Middle Tennessee, it's overwhelming support. Like, why wouldn't you want Amtrak service? But you stop short of proclaiming that we're going to support Amtrak service until you can understand the financial impact and the cost benefit there. So that's something we're studying now. But it's a legitimate opportunity. Amtrak is interested, but it will require certain things from the state of Tennessee because that's just how the funding model works. And it's not only interesting and potentially beneficial to us because of the service that we would get out of Amtrak, but it also kind of may change the game a little bit in terms of how we relate to CSX, who owns those tracks, right? When you have the federal government who has rights to those tracks, but Amtrak is the only non-private entity that has rights to those tracks. So it does change that relationship a little bit. That might open up additional doors to conversations about rail transit in Middle Tennessee. I'm not projecting anything there, but it does change that dynamic in a way that it doesn't exist now.
Another question, let me make sure I'm getting something here. What's your estimate or best estimate on the next time we see a referendum related to this, related to transit?
Well, I guess I can give you my best guess, but I mean, I can tell you that when I talk to others who are people who are influential in that decision being made, it's, you probably ask 3 or 4 people, you're gonna get 3 or 4 different answers to that. And then the other thing is to, I'll give you an answer because, why not? But but people need to, I think people need to think of ballot initiatives as being sort of individual funding opportunities. We're not likely to do here's the big ballot initiative that is going to tackle all of transportation for the next 25 years. That's just not how it's done. It's not done in Denver like that. I mean, they're waves, right? They're incremental. You focus on a tax initiative that's going to do these projects. Some of that may sunset, and then you renew it to do these projects, right? Or you change the geography. So there's likely, if you follow the model across the rest of the country, multiple ballot initiatives that would ultimately have to be pieced together to get this done. It's just the reality we live in, the way taxing authority and all those things work. It's not ideal, but it's just how it has to be done. So I would caution you to ever think of it being a one and done, like if we're successful, then we've done it. It's likely to be waves into the future of ballot initiatives and some sunsetting and being replaced, being renewed. So having said that, the timing probably depends on what is going to be proposed. And so say if Mayor Cooper wants to get a couple of things done, then that might be sooner than later. And then the package and the ask of the voters may be relatively small, but the idea being you get those projects done and then you come back, you've demonstrated success and value, you come back and maybe you take a bigger bite at the apple. If Mayor Cooper wants to, and he and the council are the ones who decide this, whether or not to move forward, that's how the state law works. If they want to do something really big, then I'd say probably the timing will be more of a 3 to 6 years, right? Versus a 1 to 3 years on the ballot initiative. So it's really about the scale and the ask is, I think, what dictates the timing. But I do think that he hasn't been shy about offering his support for transportation, and he knows more is needed there. The timing, I think, will be dictated by what's the package of projects that he's interested in getting buy-in for over the short term.
One thing to add to, sorry, just to add on to the discussion of transit referendums, Michael and I have been, tracking ballot initiatives across the country, and last November was a big push for a number of referendums, and I think 15 out of 18 passed across the country. So there's still a high success rate across the country, even though ours hasn't been successful.
And we've been tracking that for 10 plus years, and it's always been 60 to 70% a year passage. But what you often see, though, is those who are trying for the first time fail. Like failing at the ballot initiative, at the ballot box is really the price you have to pay to be successful, because it's the first time you've asked people to weigh in. They're not confident, but often they have a little bit of buyer's remorse on the back end when they get back into their car the next day and realize there's no solution. So there's definitely, and then you also, it's the first time we do studies, all the time. We're trying to figure out what to do in this quarter versus that quarter. And I tell you what, you cannot pay people to participate in those studies, even though those studies are the place where those decisions are ultimately going to be decided, right? So we want people to pay attention. It's hard to pay. Maybe we can use Hitch to pay people to participate in studies and be part of the decision-making process. But we know that about studies, it's just how it works. But what a ballot initiative does, it actually, everybody, a lot more people participate, and it's active learning for them in terms of what the options are and what those cost. I don't take failure from a ballot initiative as being a sign that nobody wants the solutions that were offered. I try to look into the reasons why they weren't able to say yes and make sure that the next effort is responsive to those, because I think it's inevitable that we'll get it done.
That's encouraging to me, because I didn't know the math on 70%, and I would have just knee-jerk bet you that it would have been the inverse. So that's almost gives me hope. So thank you for telling. That's my takeaway. One of my takeaways for today. we're out of time. This has been great. Thank you all so much. If you want to give me real quick, Michael, maybe a 1 minute on what you want our takeaway to be today. If we could take one thing away that you want to make sure we heard, tell me what that is. And thank you so much for your time today and everybody else.
Yeah, you got it. I appreciate being here. I think, from a material standpoint, take away solvethistogether.org, because that could be your connection back to us after today. And that'll get you to GNRC.org, so you don't need to worry about that. Solvethistogether.org is really the hub. So remember that, but also just remember that this is overwhelming and it could be very deflating. That's just one step in front of the other, and keep trying. And the other thing I think it's really important is that we grow the network of folks who are informed and educated about the challenges and what it's going to take to overcome those, so that that it's the dinner table conversation isn't just about how bad traffic was that day, but it sounds kind of dorky, but maybe the dinner table conversation should be about what could we be doing to fix the problem. And the more people sort of shift their mind from complaining about the problem to participating in discussions about the solution, I think the quicker we will get to those, seeing those improvements. Again, I think this is an important group. I think that's one of the things that we learned through the last few initiatives that haven't been successful, is that you've really got to, if you've got the support of the entrepreneurs who have a reputation of wanting to invest in risk in a way that they are confident will be fruitful, I think that having the endorsement of that community would speak volumes for some of our transportation initiatives.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Thanks for everybody showing up. There's going to be, if you registered, be sure you fill out the survey. It always helps us as we move forward. And again, have a great rest of your Friday and a good weekend. And you guys take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.